Thank you again this morning for letting me come and share this time with you. If you'll take your Bibles and turn with me to Mark chapter 5. While you're turning there, I want to commend you for spending this summer determined to take your faith outside of these walls. Jesus Christ makes the statement in John chapter 8, I am the light of the world. And yet he told his disciples in Matthew chapter 5, you are the light of the world. Meaning he has placed upon us the responsibility of being him out in this world. And as you go outside and beyond these walls, my prayer is going to be that you paint an accurate picture in your life and in your service to others of Jesus Christ. To do that, we really need to know what he was like. And we see him as he's serving the needs of others in Mark chapter 5. I'm going to begin reading in verse number 21. And when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered about him, and he stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and upon seeing him, fell at his feet and entreated him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her that she may get well and live. And he went off with him. And a great multitude was following him and pressing in on him. And a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was not getting helped at all, but rather had grown worse, after hearing about Jesus, came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak, for she thought, if I just touch his garment, I will get well. And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my garment? And his disciples said to him, you see the multitude pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. There are a couple of things about Jesus that I hope you saw as we read through this. Number one, he was approachable. Now, that wasn't like the religious people of his day, and especially the religious leaders. They had put a distance between themselves and the ordinary folks that were a part of their culture, their society. But not Jesus. Mark chapter 6 says, the common people heard him gladly, but they couldn't approach the religious leaders. The Pharisees, the most religious of their day, had built up over 600 additional laws to the Old Covenant just to ensure that they didn't get anywhere close to the edge. And they were so strict in their interpretation and their enforcement of what they believed that common folks just could not relate to them at all. The Sadducees had become partners with the Romans and as a result had made a lot of money, and they literally had built walls around their homes separating them from the people. The Essenes, the third religious group of that day and age, had had enough of all of it. They just actually pulled out of society and went to places like Masada, where they could just live isolated and insulated from the culture of their day. So when Jesus comes on the scene and is considered to be a rabbi, it was refreshingly different. You could actually go up and talk to him. And he had time for you. He was approachable. But beyond being approachable, he was available. Those two aren't the same. He would spend his energies and his time actually helping you. Now, again, that was so different from what they had experienced. The people in their day and age could not look to religious people to be of much help. All they got were scornful looks, but not from Jesus. He was actually available to help them. Now, that meant that he many days, in fact, might I say the overwhelming majority of days, ended up having to totally change his schedule from what he had thought that day would be like. In Mark chapter 1, he had been to the home of Simon Peter, and the whole town wanted to see him and were constantly banging on the door, to where he ended up spending his day with them, not with Peter. And that night had gone out to be alone to pray, and even Peter interrupts his prayer, wanting him to follow after his agenda. In Mark chapter 2, he's trying to teach a multitude in a room. They tear a hole in the roof and let a sick man down so that he could heal him. Jesus continually was interrupted by people. As a preacher, that was hard for me when I first started. I'd love to go into my office, close the door, get out my study materials, and inevitably the phone would ring. My dad, my granddad were both preachers. Both of them are my heroes. I remember complaining to my dad one day, I just can't get my studying done. People keep interrupting me. And he looked at me and he said, you hadn't learned it yet, have you? Interruptions are your business. I found he's right. Interruptions were Jesus' life. He dealt with them continually. And in the process of being available to people, there was something that you need to see that is going to be very much like your life. Let me illustrate. I'll pick on Bruce. What day is it in all the years he's been here with you that Bruce has ever gone home at the end of his day knowing that he has done everything that day that he can do? There's not another sick person that he could not have gone to see and ministered to. There is not a single discouraged person that he couldn't have picked up the phone and called and tried to encourage them. There's not another person that he could have set up a Bible study with. Not a single troubled person that he couldn't have gone and tried to counsel. And I can see from the look on your face, you're thinking, that's right. Bless his heart. I hope he doesn't feel under a constraint to try to think that he has to contact everybody. And you say that because you don't have a need. You see, if you were that sick person, you'd want him to come. If you were discouraged, you'd have been disappointed if he hadn't have called. Because our needs are the greatest simply because they're our needs. Jesus dealt with this repeatedly. And one of the things that is hardest for ministers to do is to be able to prioritize needs. Now, in this particular setting, Mark does something he does 3 other times in his gospel. He tells a story within a story. Jesus at this time comes to this village, and he is met with a leader of the synagogue, Jairus by name. At this time, the synagogues are closed to Jesus. The mere fact that he is open to helping this individual is a testimony in and of itself. This is a man whose group has consistently now turned their back on Jesus. But he's got a need. His 12-year-old daughter is dying. Her illness is going to take her life. And he comes before Jesus, and as all of us would do when you've got a child that's about to die, you swallow all your pride. You'll do whatever you have to. And he goes to Jesus, the one the synagogues have rejected. And he pleads with him, come. And Jesus is on his way when he's interrupted. It's a woman. She has what the King James calls an issue of blood. This New American Standard says a hemorrhage. This would have been a female disorder that was fairly common in that day. And it in her case, had drug on for 12 years now. And through this time, she hasn't ignored it. She's tried everything imaginable. In fact, she's been to every doctor you can see, and she's spent every cent of money that she has. And not only has she not gotten well, she keeps getting worse. Now, this illness did more than just make her sick. It made her unclean. If you check Leviticus chapter 15, you'll see what that means. When it came time to go to the temple, she couldn't go. Every Sabbath when people would go to the synagogues, she had to stay home. She couldn't get married. She couldn't have children. If a friend was getting married, she wasn't allowed at the wedding. If her best friend died, she couldn't go to the funeral. Once she sat down in a chair, nobody else could ever sit in that chair. She laid down in a bed, nobody else could ever sleep in that bed. She rendered everything around her as unclean. And I have wondered if at this time, for the last 12 years, if she has been touched by another human being for 12 years. Oh, she would have tried everything. The Jewish Talmud, kind of their encyclopedia of their culture, gives no less than 11 different ways that the scholars, the scribes, had said to the women that they needed to try to deal with their disease. There were fascinating. One said you would take an ostrich egg, burn it up, put it into a white napkin, and carry that around with you, and maybe you would get well. Another one said you found a white donkey, follow it till it emits dung, go through the dung until you find a barley seed intact, take that barley seed and carry it with you, and you would get well. Isn't that something? You're thinking, who in the world would do something like that? I can answer that question for you. You would. If you'd been sick for 12 years and you're getting worse, you'd be desperate enough to do anything. This woman is desperate at this hour. And here in the midst of this great crowd that has assembled, Jesus is going with Jairus to where his 12-year-old daughter is dying when this woman touches the hem of his garment. And this is a fascinating thing to me that Jesus would stop. This woman's been sick as long as this little girl has been alive. And the disciples around him, if they would have known of the circumstances, would have bound to have been thinking, Lord, look, she's been sick for 12 years. It's not a fatal illness. What difference does it make if she's sick for 12 years in one day? You got a little girl that is dying. Her daddy is rich. He's powerful. He's highly respected. This is an old woman that has spent everything she has. She doesn't have a cent or a name. She can't do anything for you. Are you getting a picture of beyond the walls? Jesus stops on this occasion. Because this woman now, in her illness, has heard that literally, verse 27, after hearing about, in the original, after hearing about the Jesus. Jesus was a common name, the Hebrew Yahshua, translated over into the Greek. A lot of people had that name. But there was one Jesus that everybody's talking about. He could lay his hands on someone who was ill, and they would be well. And I want you to see what an effort it was on her part. Remember, she's unclean. And yet she musters up the courage to do two things that were just not acceptable at all. She is longing, just as Jairus wanted him to put his hands on his daughter, that she would be well. She must have been thinking, what will it be like when he touches me and I'm well? But he can't touch her. She's unclean. And besides that, she's going to be in this great big crowd of people. She hasn't been in a crowd of people for at least 12 years. What was her day like? And yet she has enough faith that she gathers garments around her, I assume maybe even hoping that no one would recognize her, maybe disguised herself. And she goes and she touches the hem of his garment. And verse 29 says, immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body she was healed of her affliction. But it's the next verse that fascinates me. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeded from him, had gone forth. Jesus felt something. And what Mark says it was he felt that power had gone out of him. I want you to understand, ministering to the needs of people cost Jesus something. He could just feel the power draining out of him as he cared for the needs of people. Don't expect that you can go beyond these walls and it not cost you something. I don't know all that is meant by that statement with Jesus, but I know he felt something going forth from him. And so he turns around and he said, who touched my garments? And I don't want you to think that this is just setting the stage for something else on his part. I know John 2 says that Jesus didn't need for anyone to tell him what was in man, for he himself knew what was in man. You probably are thinking, he didn't have to ask that question. He knew good and well who had touched him. I'm going to submit to you, no, he didn't. Then why is he asking this question? Because he knew from what had just happened, God had chosen to bless somebody, and he wanted to know who it was his Father has just decided to bless. Who touched me? And the disciples, of course, what do you mean, who touched you? Everybody's pressing around you. Ah, yeah. But only one of them was healed. A lot of other people touched Jesus that day, but they didn't get the blessing this woman did. Were all of them perfectly okay? Everybody's life in good order? Everybody feeling good that day? I seriously doubt it. Jairus' daughter certainly wasn't. What makes us think all the rest of the crowd would have been? But only one received that blessing. And Jesus wants to know which one it is. He doesn't just indiscriminately bless people. He was there to minister to the real needs of those who, like this woman, were open to faith. Look what happens. She comes and she bows down before him, evidently, and she testifies to the whole truth. And Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Literally, your faith has saved you. You probably check the center column reference of your Bible and see that that's the literal word that's used. Jesus was able to heal a lot of people who didn't believe. He's never saved anybody who didn't have faith. This woman had some faith that day. But do you notice she has been locked out of the lives of the deeply religious people because she was unclean? When we go beyond the walls, my prayer is going to be that you're going to be finding people who have felt locked out because of some uncleanness in their life. And you will be the avenue by which their life is blessed. The only time in all the scriptures I can find where Jesus ever said this is right here. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Daughter. Let me tell you what happened at this moment. For 12 years, this woman has not mattered to anybody. Now, she matters to someone. She mattered to Jesus. I hope when you go beyond these walls, you find people in Russellville who haven't mattered in a long time. And you let them know, but you matter to me. You matter to Jesus. The needs that surround us, we're so blinded. We don't even notice. We lost a national treasure when we lost Irma Bombeck. 1996, kidney disease. It took her far too early. She just had a way of calling our attention to things that helped us to see ourselves. She had just come out with a new book, and her publisher had sent her on a 3-week tour around the nation promoting that book and the book sales. She had had numerous interviews and been to a lot of bookstores for signing parties. She had finally finished in Atlanta late one night, the last of her scheduled events, got to her room, was going to catch a plane early the next morning back to Chicago, and decided to get to the airport a little bit early in hopes that no one would recognize her. She had worn a cap on her head with her hair hidden under it, just sweatshirt, plain clothing, no makeup. Had a book with her that she wanted to read, that she had had an interest in, and got to the airport, and before the very many people were there to board the plane, set off sort of in an aisle away from the gate, hoping not to be bothered. Hadn't been there too long when an elderly woman came in and, of all things, just sat down in the aisle right across from her. And Irma Bombeck talks as she read her book, didn't make eye contact, hoping to be left alone. But sure enough, after a few moments, the woman began to speak. A voice next to me, belonging to an elderly woman, said, "I hear it's cold in Chicago." Stone-faced, I answered, "That's likely." "I haven't been to Chicago in nearly 3 years," she persisted. "My son lives there." "That's nice," I said, my eyes never leaving the printed page of the book. "My husband's body is on the plane. We've been married for 53 years. I don't drive, you know, and when he died, one of the nuns drove me home from the hospital. The funeral director let me ride to the airport with him. I don't think I ever detested myself more than I did at that moment. Another human being was screaming to be heard, and in desperation had turned to a cold stranger who was more interested in a novel than in the real-life drama at her elbow. And all she needed was a listener. No advice, no wisdom, no experience, no money. Just a few moments to listen. She talked numbly and steadily until we boarded the plane and found her seat. Mine was a couple of rows behind her. As I stored my belongings in the overhead bin, I heard her say to the lady seated beside her, "I hear it's cold in Chicago," and I prayed, "Please, Lord, let her listen." That's what happens beyond the walls. People who haven't mattered really do matter to God. And we're His avenue for letting them know that they matter. You ready to do that? To be the instrument through whom He makes an eternal difference. If you have a need for Him yourself this morning, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing.
Love one another.